Welcome to the Ayaan Hirsi podcast, a home for critical thinking and common sense. I'm delighted to have Helen Joyce on the podcast today. Helen is the Economist's Britain editor. She joined the paper in 2005 as an education correspondent, and between 2010 and 2013 was the Brazil correspondent based in São Paulo. Since then, she has edited the paper's international section and finance and economics sections. She has a PhD in mathematics from University College London, and before joining The Economist, she edited Plus, an online magazine about math published by the University of Cambridge, and the Royal Statistical Society's magazine Significance. Helen has a new book out this week titled Trans, When Ideology Meets Reality. Helen, welcome to my podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for doing this. And I will start by asking you about your early life. You know, who are you, the household that you grew up in? And I'm interested in all of this as a lead up to give my audience a context on why you decided to write on this particular subject. So please.
Sure, I'll give you a very condensed version because I've taken various winding paths to where I am now. I'm Irish, I'm 52. I'm the eldest of 9 kids, brought up in a Catholic family just outside Dublin, 5 younger brothers and 3 younger sisters. I trained as a dancer when I left school, and then I went and did a mathematics degree when that didn't work out and actually decided to be an academic. I stayed and did a PhD in mathematics and some postdoctoral work as well before deciding that hadn't worked out either. And I went into public understanding of mathematics then and spent a few years working for Cambridge University and the Royal Statistical Society, editing magazines about maths and stats. And then I applied for a job at The Economist. I saw an ad for an education correspondent in 2005. And I've worked at The Economist since then, covering education. Then I went out to Brazil in 2010. I came back and I was our international editor and then our finance editor. And most recently, I've just been appointed Britain editor of The Economist.
That is quite an impressive journalistic career, but also impressive that you did mathematics. I have to admit that is my weakest point. I'm one of those girls who just doesn't have a head for numbers. And talking of numbers, you were growing up as an Irish Catholic in Ireland. What was life like going to school, and especially high school? And being a young girl there, you also mentioned that you were you had a go at dancing. I was going to say that is dancing is obviously a body conscious effort, I must say.
So, I mean, Ireland was an almost entirely monocultural place. I was born in 1968, and when I was 14, so in 1982, was the first time that I left Ireland. I went to London for a holiday with my mother, and that was the first time I saw someone who wasn't white in person, other than on the BBC television programs, you know. So, you know, literally that monocultural. There wasn't a non-white person in my class at university. It wasn't until I went to Cambridge to do my postgrad work that I actually got to know some people who weren't white. And not just white, I mean, white, you know, like foreign meant that you were an English Protestant. That said, in some ways, I think it was a freer society than some people have now. Like, that sounds like a very claustrophobic society, but of course, Irish people travel everywhere. So Irish people are very outward looking and always thinking about what's going on around the world. You know, it was a joke to me that if you saw some catastrophe somewhere in the world, like a mudslide or an earthquake or somebody, they'd find themselves someone English speaking to talk to, 2 minutes after it happened. It'd be an Irish person, really quite often. And then the other thing I would say is that children of my generation were very much less gendered than children are now. So, you know, my hair wasn't curled and it didn't matter what I played with. You know, the Lego wasn't pink for girls and, blue for boys. There was none of that stuff. So I was brought up with the idea that a girl can do anything or be anything. There's no way that you can get cast out of your sex class by how you behave. And that's something that stayed with me. To me, a woman or a girl is just somebody with a female body doing anything she feels like. And a boy, the same for, a male body, as opposed to feeling that those are social roles that you are constrained by and that you must perform.
That's interesting. did you have any encounters as a young woman with, for me, it is a bit of history, but also it was something that was taken geographically somewhere else, which is the anorexia bulimia contagion, where girls would say they didn't feel good looking the way they looked, and then try to, by embarking on these extreme diets, try and change their bodies.
So yes, when I had left school and went off to dancing school, for sure, because obviously it's a profession that's really riven with body disorders, and I would say it's one of the reasons that I actually stopped dancing. I'm not a fat person, but I'm not a very thin person, and I just wasn't able to be thin enough. But at school, no, because again, I was just a little bit before it. Eating disorders are hugely, hugely contagious. Girls teach each other these disordered behaviours. So one of the girls I interviewed for the book, actually, which we're going to be talking about in a bit, she also had an eating disorder on top of her gender issues. And I mentioned to her that someone who was a bit younger than me remembered in secondary school being shown a video about how bulimics make themselves sick by throwing their toothbrush down, putting their toothbrush down their throats. And her face turned red and she looked like she was about to start crying. And she said, "Oh, but that's how I make myself sick." So that's how those girls learned to make themselves sick. So that was my first encounter really with the idea that that social contagion is part of some sorts of illnesses. Like psychosomatic disorders are things that are shaped by our societies and shaped by, in particular, the medical profession. So I did see that at dancing school for sure, but it's not something I've ever suffered from, thanks be to goodness. It's very miserable.
I raise this because we're just about to talk about your new book, which I recommend to everyone. The title of the book is Trans, When Ideology Meets Reality. And on this subject, I've seen some comparisons made with just young girls being unhappy with their bodies and with being female. And that has nothing to do with wanting to transition to becoming men. It's just almost the same, I don't look good enough, I don't feel good in my body. And then now they're in a context where they have all of these options, and instead of an eating disorder contagion, we are seeing a gender dysphoria contagion. Is it fair to put it that way?
It certainly is for this new contingent. So if I go back just a little bit, as I explain in the book, there are quite different groups of people who seek to transition. People who feel that they were really meant to be of the opposite sex, or that they are in some sense inwardly members of the opposite sex. And one group that didn't present with that until extremely recently are teenage girls. So it was almost exclusively older men and younger boys, and a few lesbian women who really found life just much more congenial living as men. But then since about 2015, the numbers have really soared, and now the predominant presentation at gender clinics around the world is teenage girls. And they are the group who are most prone to social contagion. Things like, if you look at historical records, these weird fits of, hysterical laughter or fainting or things like that, they run through places like convents and all-girls schools. Of course, they're still rare events, but that's the places that they get seen. And so what we're seeing now, and in particular the internet, is the vector. The medical profession does push it, but it's the internet where these girls teach themselves, they coach themselves, places like Tumblr. Tumblr is the worst, really. And that's where you go, if you feel a generalized dis-ease with yourself. And as I said, this is a very gendered society that we live in now. Lots of girls find it very constraining to think that they have to be all pretty and smart and made up and perfect and slim and all of those things. On top of that, we've got all the online porn, and lots of girls really don't want to grow up into those bodies that are abused and spat on and throttled and degraded on sites that they have seen since they were little in school, because those things get passed around. So they want to escape from womanhood, and the same girls may cut themselves or starve themselves or go into depression and hide in their bedrooms or whatever. And when they're there, they go and look online. They say, why do I feel so bad? Why do I hate myself so much? Why do I hate my breasts? And the answer they'll find is, you might be trans. And that idea is like this dangerous seed that gets planted. And, I talked to girls who said that they hadn't heard of transgender really, and then 2 weeks later they believed they were trans. It explained everything. And the last thing I'd say about it is the promise is that when you transition, everything will be perfect. You'll be well. All your problems will be solved. You're a new person. You can wipe the slate clean. That's the promise, that it's going to make everything better. Well, what teenage kid wouldn't like everything to be better? What teenage kid would like to be a new person?
So I want us to continue on this line of how it's affecting girls, especially young girls, and that takes me straight into feminism. And again, in the parallels between the eating disorders and what's going on now. When the eating disorders were a big thing, feminists were out there protesting and saying it's wrong to have young girls, look at themselves and feel disgust with their bodies. And so social norms had to change, and we had to encourage healthy eating habits and healthy ways of looking at yourself. I don't see any of this kind of activism coming out of feminists now in order to protect vulnerable teenagers. Why is that?
So that's true in the States. It's not true in the UK, where I am now. I think there's a resurgent feminist movement that's a realism feminism that's rooted in female bodies and the reality and salience of those female bodies. But certainly in the States, feminism has gone down this weird, disembodied sort of, it's almost like a path to, God, it's almost impossible for me to describe how crazy it is. Like just the other day, I was looking at some feminist organization praising males for competing in women's sports, as if, like males make the best women or something. I feel like I'm in the upside down. Like American feminism has gone so badly wrong. I think if we go back to the 1990s, was where American feminism took this postmodern turn away from the concerns of real people with real bodies. So issues like eating disorders, male violence, obstetric violence, things that an embodied mammal with a female body living in this human world that we've created, the things that affect us, and turned into this way of talking as if we were disembodied creatures. I've heard people call us, meat Lego, like there's a homunculus living in the head of the meat Lego creature, and you can cut some bits off and put on other bits and substitute things in and out and turn yourself into something else. It's almost post-humanist in its bizarre ignorance of bodies. Yeah, so this body denialist turn has been unbelievably bad for American feminism, and therefore unbelievably bad for American women.
Yes. And American feminists have gone down that path, or either have stayed silent or moved on to other issues. I call it the glass ceiling feminism that's prevalent. My friend Christina Sommers has written quite a lot about what she calls fainting couch feminism. Yeah, there's just a fixation on things that are either not life and death, not very serious, or don't affect the general population. And in this case, we're talking about teenage girls. What I don't want us to do on this podcast is to come across as hostile to transgender people, because neither of us are that. And when you and I started, just before we started the podcast, I said, I know people who are transgender. And then there are the transgender activists. Could you please just explain to us the difference between the people who are truly, genuinely transgender and their history, all the way back from when it was called transsexual, to what a number of activists have twisted in a way to become something entirely different?
So it seems like there have always been a very tiny, and I mean really tiny, one in tens of thousands of people who feel really deeply and strongly that they're in the wrong body. Now, I don't believe anyone can be in the wrong body, and I believe that the feeling of wishing that you are a woman is something that only a man can feel. I don't think it makes you into a woman. Nevertheless, that person is someone who probably needs some serious psychological, psychiatric, and perhaps medical support. And there were doctors very cautiously in the 1980s and 1990s attempting to find ways to help these people to live comfortably. And, it doesn't work brilliantly. The medicine isn't fantastic. The surgery isn't fantastic. Nevertheless, when they followed this tiny number of people up, they found that they were indeed mostly somewhat happier afterwards. And, that's a success in the context of a psychiatric condition that makes somebody suffer really very deeply. And then I don't know, I still sort of feel puzzled. I've tried in the book to explain how that got turned into the next so-called civil rights movement. I sort of feel like they were looking around for the next civil rights movement. We'd had feminism. I mean, there's still work for feminists to do. Nevertheless, it's not at the level of, actually winning the vote or not being the property of your husband. Of course, there's still racism. It's not the Jim Crow laws. Of course, there's still homophobia, but we now have equality before the law and equal marriage. But you've also got this huge, big apparatus of civil rights bodies, people like the ACLU and GLAAD and HRC, who are big money-making machines and are now really, really entrenched in Washington politics, in particular in Democratic politics. They're not going to just fold up their tent and say, job done, tens of millions a year can go to something else, let's all go home. So they really moved on to the next so-called civil rights cause. Now, I don't think that enabling any person to present themselves as a member of the sex they are not is actually a civil right. But it does look like it if you don't think about it at a sort of drive-by speed. And especially if you're somebody like me, who was I called myself a feminist since I was an early teenager. Of course, I was anti-racist. I was absolutely delighted when gay marriage was voted through in Ireland. Along comes the next movement. You think, yes, okay, next minority, very tiny one this time. But, fine, it doesn't matter if the minority is tiny, it still deserves its rights. And only afterwards do you start thinking, hang on, it's a little bit different to say, gay people should be able to marry on the same basis as straight people, as it is to say males should be able to compete in sport as females. It's not the same at all. It impacts on other people in a different way. But so the activists, I think, were looking for the next cause, and everybody else's sort of generalized goodwill towards progressive causes, and in particular towards these organizations with great names that had done fantastic things, meant that this cause really got taken up before people examined it cautiously.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And then you describe not only that, but also the politicization of scientific research and what that entails, really.
It's so awful. It really is. I mean, some of the things that I've read and done in this book have just depressed me beyond belief. I mean, I thought I cared about free speech before I started writing about it, and now I really care about free speech. But I think the thing that really upsets me most is what's happened to scientific and in particular medical research. So the quality of the research in this field is absolutely abysmal. Every time I write about it, somebody well-meaning will send me a letter saying, why do you say this? We know for sure that puberty blockers help teenage children and they'll all commit suicide if you don't give them puberty blockers, and they'll link me to some paper. And you look at the paper and it's atrocious. It's some survey that they've done on some activist website, so you can't use that for a start because it's not a properly constituted sample. And then they've asked leading questions, and then it turns out that actually the data is super corrupted. Like one of them, most of the people who said that they had used puberty blockers were actually too old to have used puberty blockers because they weren't introduced into America until 2007. And they just sort of kind of tried to wish all of these problems away and then came out with this ridiculous result that the data, like 10 times this data should have been thrown out. And then this paper gets published in one of the top 3 journals in the field. And then, of course, it gets reported all around the world, like op-eds in the New York Times, picked up in Sweden, picked up all over Europe. It just makes it everywhere. And honestly, it's something that in your first year doing, a basic stats course in any science course anywhere in the world, you should be failed for. And then I know people who are trying to do good work and who've produced proper data sets and have done careful analysis, and they can't get their work published. I know one guy who's had 8 rejections. So the politicization of the journals and of the learned bodies as well, really disgraceful.
It is disgraceful, and it actually enters into all sorts of other fields. I spoke a few days ago to Dr. Kenneth Zucker, a Canadian who's been dealing with gender dysphoria for a very, very long time. And his experience where he was fired from his job, he was ostracized. I mean, there's been some kind of settlement afterwards, but they went to destroy his reputation, his livelihood, his work. And a consequence of that within the scientific community is they allow these trashy papers to be published without rebuttal, because they just can't risk the consequences.
So I interviewed Ken Zucker actually for my book. I visited Toronto and actually Vancouver as well. And it's absolutely shocking what happened to him. And not just him, but other people too. So he was He was subjected to a real show trial. It's the only way to put it. They did a report on him that really just contained outright lies, like things that could easily have been disproven. And in fact, were disproven afterwards. But he was just marched out of the door, and he had to spend the next 3 years trying to regain his reputation. He had to take several suits against a newspaper, against his former employer. During that time, he was de-invited from the WPATH conference, which is the global organisation, the big organisation that has all the gender doctors in it. I mean, he was really dragged through the mud, and everybody had to apologise and pay him a settlement, 2.5 years later. But you don't get that time back. And there's still people who think that he's some sort of bigot. And his entire crime was simply that he practices gender medicine the old-fashioned way, which is that you don't assume that a child who says to you, I think I'm really a girl, I think I'm really a boy, thereby is a girl or a boy. You think, I wonder why might they think that? And often what you'll find is it is about being a proto-gay. And there's a really long-standing record of research that shows that most gender non-conforming and gender dysphoric children are actually set on a path to being gay, but of course they don't realise until they hit puberty. And so those children are now being told, yes, you are indeed a member of the opposite sex. They're then put on these drugs, these puberty blockers. They're then put on cross-sex hormones. They're then given surgeries. They're made lifelong medical patients. And by the way, they're sterile and probably sexually functionless because they've never gone through their own puberty. It's a massive human rights abuse, what's being done to these children. And it's being done in the name of human rights. And people like Ken Zucker, who just said, let's talk to these children and not rush with them, are being treated like they're massive bigots and transphobes.
And the organizations, the activists that are treating people like Mark Zucker, like Ken Zucker this way, they have actually won, because even though there was an apology and even though there was some form of compensation, the message they get across to other doctors and other professionals is stay away from this.
Yeah, and journalists too, I have to say. When I started writing about this, which is about 3 years ago now, it was just by chance. It was just that somebody asked me, what's happening with all these kids saying that they're transgender? And I said, no idea, I'll look into it. And, what I found, it bothered me right from the start. It just didn't seem logical or consistent. And it did seem very doctrinaire. And that's always a bit of a giveaway, isn't it, when people won't take any conversation or dissent. But I would say it took me probably about a year to work out that I was seriously alarmed. And by then I realised that I'd got a really big story. And that's when I started to think that I was going to be scooped, that some other journalist would come in and write it first. And then I realised hardly anybody is. Like, either they're younger journalists who came up themselves in this very censorious campus activism tradition, and in fact have been taught absolute tosspot nonsense at university. Like young people in their 20s literally saying things to me like, oh, it's impossible to define woman. And of course, sex is a spectrum. And there's no such thing as male and female. And 1.7% of people are intersex. All these nonsense things that at first I would go to myself, I don't know what to say to that. It's so insane. And now I know what to say because I'm prepared. But yeah, so a lot of the journalists are in this weird mindset where they've been taught nonsense. A lot more of them just scared. Like, I've had journalists say to me at parties or industry events, they say, oh, rather you than me, I wouldn't go near that. The activists are absolute lunatics and they won't stop till they bring you down. You're very brave. So that's no way for civil discourse to function. It's no way for truth to be found.
No. So you've discussed the hijacking of the civil rights organizations. You've discussed the hijacking to a degree of the feminists, at least here in the United States, of the feminist movement and feminist organizations. And then medical research and other scientific research. And then now journalism. So it really is astonishing to have to witness this from the inside. And I share this with you. I would be in parties where people would be among peers and they would whisper about this, because if a colleague or someone else present at the party overheard you saying what you just told me, that would be the end of your career.
So the one thing I will say is I'm actually a little bit hopeful, which is that I think we're in a situation that's called pluralistic ignorance. I don't think these ideas are popular at all. I don't think that many people truly think that it's impossible to tell the difference between men and women, or truly think that you can turn men into women. I mean, people are generally very sympathetic towards trans people and feel that they should be accommodated because this is pretty tough. Feeling that you're in the wrong body must be pretty tough. That doesn't mean people think seriously that you should be allowing male people into women's sports, or that you should be putting, male rapists into women's prisons or something. These are immensely, immensely unpopular ideas. Most people either don't know about them or know enough to feel kind of concerned, but don't feel they know enough to actually go out on a limb, or indeed, as you say, they're frightened. But that's like the situation towards the end of the various communist regimes, where people didn't dare to say what they really thought. And the great thing about those situations is that when the pebble falls, the avalanche starts. So I think we could see that quite quickly. I mean, I've seen a big change already in the past 2 years, especially here in the UK. Just in the past week, I've had two experiences that I thought were quite indicative. One was to my husband, who met with an old friend from university who actually is a psychiatrist. And she just wanted to talk to him about my book. And she was livid. She was saying, what are they doing to these children? This is disgraceful. This is not medicine. It's all they talked about. And then I mentioned this to a friend who's not ed, to do with my family or work. And he said that he and his wife had met somebody recently that they hadn't seen for a while. And he said there was a good 15 minutes of them kind of dancing around, like trying to say things that weren't too obvious to try and gauge what the other one thought. And then finally, they both worked out that the other one thought gender medicine had gone completely mad, and that they're, sterilizing kids and it's a human rights abuse and so on. And then that's all they talked about either. So I think we're in that sort of samizdat state, at least here in the UK, where lots of people are waking up to the fact that this is terrible, and more people are starting to speak, and that'll make more people speak quite quickly. I think we could quite quickly here in the States, or here in the UK, not yet in the States, see a big shift.
Well, I think we're close behind you, and I share your optimism. The things that make me pessimistic are that the politicization has now, as you mentioned earlier, it has gone into political parties, in our case, prevalent in the Democratic Party. And then that is quickly followed by legislation.
Yes.
So here in California, the state that I live in, they've passed a law that, require, when you say I'm trans, or, I identify as a woman and you're a man, no questions asked. I think in the beginning, you and I talked about it. I got a piece written by Abigail Schreier. Mm-hmm. What is happening in prisons, where women inmates are being confronted with men coming in, pretending that they are women, and then abusing them. And this is just, it's absolutely outrageous, but this is a consequence of legislation. It's not just civil discourse.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with polarization is that the extremes capture the parties. So I don't think even most Democrats think it's a great idea. I mean, no one went into party politics in order that they could put rapists and serial killers of women into women's jails. That's just not what people go into politics for. I mean, that's what you go into, some Central American drug gang for. So I don't think that most people in politics actually actively want that. It's just that it's become a shibboleth of the left, that you believe this, and you know that if you step out of line, that is your career over. And it turns out most people don't think very hard. Most people aren't brave. And I am disturbingly coming to believe that a lot of people don't actually give a toss about women. I mean, I can't sleep when I think about the idea of being locked up with, one of these violent men. So there's this guy who was transferred to a women's prison in America, and he murdered his wife because she came home and found him putting on her clothes, cross-dressing in her clothes. So he throttled her with a piano wire with such violence that he nearly took her head off. And then he said he was a woman. And so all these civil rights organizations in the States, and all these so-called feminist organizations, came in behind him and said that it was a human rights abuse to leave him in a men's prison. I don't think anyone who puts rapists and serial killers and murderers of their wives and so on into women's prisons can call themselves a feminist. I mean, these things are war crimes if they're done in the context of war. Yeah. It's absolutely disgraceful.
It is disgraceful, and it's shocking. And I think we just need a new or a renewed feminist movement that is sane, that can really.
You do.
Absolutely. Please, can you also talk about what happens to young girls who get caught up in this frenzy and get their bodies changed, and then as soon as they mature, want to change back and can't? Because I think the more we describe these things in detail, the more people will wake up to it and feel the exact same outrage that we're feeling.
Yeah, that's what really made me feel outraged first. I because I said to you, I'm a mathematician, the thing that bothered me first was this circular definition. A woman is anyone who feels like a woman. But then what's a woman? It means nothing. It's empty. And when you legislate with an empty definition at its core, you produce nonsense laws. Anybody can be anything.
Yes.
It just means nothing. So that's what got me intrigued in the first place. But the thing that made me decide to write the book was meeting detransitioners for the first time. And they were all girls, but I think there are boys as well. And these are kids, all of them with their own sad stories. They've been abused, or in the case of the girls I met first, they were all lesbian girls who hadn't accepted that truth about themselves. And as I said, the research shows that people who were destined to grow up gay are really very likely to be gender non-conforming in childhood. And that can lead them to think, depending on what society around them is like, if it's not accepting, that can lead them to think that they must be members of the opposite sex. And then that creates the dysphoria. So then there was one girl in particular who had a very severe eating disorder, and she'd been hospitalized several times and, really came close to death. And then when she went to see a therapist, first she searched, that was it. She searched online to see if you could get your breasts cut off without a medical reason, because she hated her breasts. Now her breasts are tiny, but they were fat as far as she was concerned. And that's where she found the idea of being trans. And within about a week, she believed that she was a man. She was about 17 at this time. She went to see a therapist. That's all he said. He said, yep, you're trans. He said to her, your eating disorder will go. The reason you have an eating disorder is because you're meant to be a man. You are a man, but you've got a woman's body. You're trying to starve away your curves. Her parents were delighted because her parents felt that this was the answer. Their child would stop starving herself. She had everything. She had her breasts removed. She had her uterus removed. She had her ovaries removed. She took testosterone. She grew facial hair. Her voice broke. She built up muscle. She kept eating disorder, continued. She continued dysphoric. She felt like a fraud because actually she passed. She looked like a kind of young boy, but, she passed outwardly, but at home she didn't feel like she was a man. And then at the point at which, and of course, and like nobody was giving her the support she needed for these extraordinary medical procedures she'd been through. Like they're just like, yeah, get your uterus out and it'll be fine. Like my mum had her uterus removed in her middle age, and she wasn't well for a year. Yeah, like it's a major operation. They don't tell you these things though in gender medicine. Yeah. And then one day she just thought, how could an operation that can only be done to a woman turn somebody into a man? Yeah. And it was like this Damascene conversion. What she had believed for about 5 years just made no sense to her at all. Yeah. But of course now she's sterile. Yeah. She's been through something that can't be given back to her, and she's hated and treated like an apostate by all the gender activists.
Because she's coming out
because they believe that she's lying. They believe that she's a tool of the American right. I mean, this is the most absurd thing that is said about these kids. Yeah. That they're all paid by the Heritage Foundation to make it up or something. I mean, for goodness sake.
It's just, it really is mind-boggling that...
It is.
Yeah, the therapist that she first goes to, so now we're talking about the mental health community, directing her, or sending her off in the wrong direction. And then she has to go through all of this, and there's no one for her. And this is example after example after example.
And there's no accountability whatsoever. And in fact, a lot of American states and some countries in Europe as well are passing laws to say that any treatment other than what they call affirmation, meaning just, yep, you are actually a boy, here's the drugs. Any treatment other than that is counted as conversion therapy. And of course, we've all learned that conversion therapy is a terrible thing, because that's what used to be done to gay people, electric shocks and basically torture to try to straighten them out. And that didn't work. But the idea that saying to a girl who's got a severe eating disorder and is, very disturbed in various different ways, look, let's go slow. Let's talk about this. And can I talk to you? Do you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend? Yeah. What's the situation like at school? You may have heard of Kira Bell, who's this girl here in the UK.
A hero. I've read about her.
Yeah, she is a hero. She really is. So I know Kira. She lives quite near me. And her back history is not an easy back history at all. And in particular, she was a school refuser. Bad things were happening for her at home, and she just didn't go into school at all for about 2 years. Well, when she first went to the gender clinic, they didn't ask her about any of that. Yeah. She was basically struggling with her same-sex attraction, problems at home, violence, drugs in the family, school refusal. None of that came out in this interview. It was just, yep, let's cut your breasts off and give you testosterone.
There was a 60 Minutes report hosted by Leslie Stahl, and she speaks to individuals who, just like Kira, who go through transition, and the stories they tell are just as shocking, disturbing backgrounds, but also the speed with which these things are done.
And then there's these lies. They say, the activists say, oh, nobody is doing this to children. Nobody is doing this without a very careful evaluation. Yes, they are doing it to children. They have done mastectomies on girls as young as 13. I mean, really, a 13 and the thing is they hide this by saying, a trans male, and people think, oh, a trans male, this person must be male. Like they must be talking about a male person who for some reason has extra growth in their breast tissue. No, when they say trans male, they mean female. So the perversion of language is part of it all too.
Yes.
No male can become a female. No male has become a female in 210 million years in among mammals. That's how long there have been mammals. And in all of that time, no male has become a female. And yet in your American laws, right?
Yes.
A male person is someone who may have been assigned the gender female at birth, but who grows up to assert the gender male. Well, male isn't a gender. I mean, beetroot can be male, monkeys and trees and everything can be male, for God's sake.
Yes. Yeah. No, I really think we are going through some crazy social changes here. And this is just one chapter of it. The transgender activism and all that is coming out of it. A few times you pointed out that the United Kingdom is actually different when it comes to developing adequate policies. And could you please just give us an outline of how the different countries, and you've done this in your book very well, but for the audience.
Sure.
The differences between North America, UK, US, Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So this is an American madness. This grew out of American campuses. So you're patient zero. So of course it's worst for you. Well, actually, it's actually slightly worse for Canada because it's not just all of America. It's half of America. It's Democrat America. It's blue America. Red America, for reasons that I don't think are particularly to do with social justice or civil rights, hasn't really fallen for the idea that there's no such thing as men and women. But, good, great, they've noticed. So half of America has gone completely clinically insane. I mean, I think to say that there is no such thing as male and female is actually insane. It's a societal insanity. And Canada has caught it. It's your nearest neighbor, and it's like blue America without the red America balancing it. So Canada's even worse.
Yeah.
But so we're your next nearest cultural neighbors in the UK. Yeah. So it's pretty bad here, and universities in particular are pretty bad. And what kids are taught in university, if they take a course like gender studies or sociology or anything like that, they be taught nonsense of the most horrifying level. And it's even creeping into other subjects. I've heard about people studying medicine.
Yeah.
I know a sports scientist, a trainee sports scientist, who swears that there's no physiological strength advantage for being male.
Yes.
This is somebody who's studying to be a physio.
I've seen it. I've seen it all.
Yeah.
I've heard it all. Yeah.
So the universities here are mad, but British feminism is a much more materialist sort of based thing than American feminism. It never went down that path. It also has a record of much greater successes on material matters such as maternity leave and abortion rights and so on. And a lot of it is very linked to the unions. So it's people which are not the force they used to be, but at least these women have learned to do actual solid organising. And the last thing I would say is we've had protections in this country since the 1990s, in fact, for people who are gay or who are transgender. So you haven't got those protections at a federal level until extremely recently. So it's kind of hard to fight against a lunatic version of trans rights when there are no trans rights. It's easier to fight against a lunatic version of trans rights when we have sensible trans rights. Right. Like it's illegal in this country to fire somebody or discriminate against them in healthcare or in housing or in provision of services because they're gay or trans. And it has been for 30 years or something under European law.
Right.
So all these reasons meant that, here we could organize faster. It came to us later. We saw what madness was happening in the States and started to organize. And the laws actually had to be changed here if they wanted to introduce gender self-ID, whereas I think they just had to be introduced in the States.
That's right.
So there was much more opportunity to fight here. And also, finally, we don't have anything like the level of political polarization.
Yes.
So here, if somebody says, hang on, I don't think the boys should be in girls' changing rooms, people don't say, oh, you're obviously anti-abortion, young earth creationist, Donald Trump fan. There's nothing like that.
There is no Donald Trump,
Yeah, I mean, you do not have to be a Donald Trump fan to notice that there are two types of humans, male and female.
Yeah.
But in America, it really feels like it.
Yes. Yes, I think that they have been, in America, we have empowered the looniest, craziest, most radical individuals to take over the entire civil discourse and institutions of culture and meaning making. And that's
and they will have to fall some of those institutions. I don't think there's any way back for people like the ACLU. I mean, when you are actually actively attempting to force women to accept rapists in women's jails and any male who wants in women's sporting competitions, and attempting to get anyone who argues with you fired, I think you've gone to a point of no return. So here in the UK, we're creating new institutions. I mean, our institutions have also failed. Stonewall, which is the biggest of gay rights organisations here, is now just a trans lobby group, and is actively campaigning in a homophobic manner and actively campaigning to get women's rights taken away from them. But we have a new LGBT alliance, and we have a new group called Sex Matters, which is campaigning for real feminism. Mm-hmm. That's what you're going to have to do. You just, it feels awful. It feels like, all this work has gone into these great organisations that have this storied history, mm-hmm. but they have been captured and they're just going to have to fall.
Yeah, some will fall, and some I think we'll have to recapture. We can't give away all of them.
I'm quite nihilistic, actually. I think that there comes a point when an organisation, you're going to have to. When I say burn it down, I mean figuratively. So yes, just in case there are people who are hard of thinking out there who are going to say, "I want to, cause arson." I'm thinking of the biblical phrase of, burning it to the ground and then sowing the ground with salt so that nothing can grow back. Yes. I don't know how you can come back from some of these positions that they've got themselves into.
It's very difficult. My husband feels the same way as you do about the universities, where he says this is it's too far gone. The only real response would be to establish new schools, new universities. But you see what a big effort that would be.
Yes, I know, but I don't know about the universities. I think some universities, it depends how far it goes before it starts to reverse. I mean, you've already started to see, real incursions even into mathematics and physics. And a year ago, I would have said that was impossible. If the tide can be turned before everything falls, then maybe you can start to win departments back one at a time.
Yeah. I'm a bit optimistic, and I'm right now invested in the more, the premise that you voiced earlier, which was most people, that is the average person, really doesn't know about these issues. And when they find out, they feel a sense of outrage. And I think now we are on a good path to educating the public. And here's why I think both of us and other people in my orbit, we care so much about free speech, because the minute you say this can't be talked about and that can't be talked about, then these crazy ideas just go forth and burn the house down. And so I think I'm more optimistic, but I wanted to ask you two scenarios, and this is my final question, which is,
sure,
20 years from now, in the most optimistic scenario, what do you see? And then I'll ask you the exact same question, but then for the most pessimistic scenario.
So the most optimistic scenario, I would say, is that this all feels like a fever dream and a lot of people will have already forgotten it. And we do have precedent for that, actually, which was the 1990s satanic panic, which grew out of this strange, another sort of psychic contagion of two linked diseases, mental illnesses, which were multiple personality disorder and dissociative disorder. And these are actually existing things. Like, they're very, very occasionally people are dissociative, but they were turned into mass diagnoses by sort of celebrity, psychotherapists, and by books. And several million Americans came to believe that they had memories, that they had been abused as children, that they had buried the memories, that they had split, that this is what all their problems were because of these things. And there are books written at the time that are out of print now that describe, the destruction this wreaked on people's lives. Like, people hospitalized, their children taken away, their minds destroyed, and those people were destroyed and they cannot be recovered. But actually, a lot of people don't know this even happened now, 20-something years later.
And one of them,
I highly recommend.
And one of them, I've heard of all sorts of cultish movements, but more like a freak show type of thing. I didn't realize any of that was ever mainstreamed.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, literally several million Americans will have believed that they had been abused. And now, listen, people are abused as children.
Yes.
And people do forget the details of their abuse, because when things happen to you when you're small, you forget them. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who believe that they were, trafficked around America by a satanic cult, that they were forced through multiple abortions, that they had to eat dead babies, that famous people and their own parents, did black masses in basements, and, completely crazy things. These ideas were planted in their heads by the therapists, and people had their children taken away from them because their grown children accused them of doing awful things. And it wasn't until there were court cases in which the accusations were so extraordinarily outlandish and disprovable that actually some American states stopped accepting evidence that was found under hypnosis, and also the medical insurers stopped reimbursing this sort of treatment. And of course, these people, the therapists don't do this for free. They were making fortunes out of it. Yeah. So the optimistic scenario, I know that doesn't sound very optimistic, but actually the optimistic scenario is that in 20-something years, this all seems like a fever dream. Some of us remember it. A lot of people don't. Yeah. There's a lot of people who were destroyed by it, I'm sorry to say.
Yes.
And we have to be thinking about them and how we can help them to recover. And, there isn't much accountability. I don't expect much accountability. I think a lot of people will just row away from the madder things they said. I don't think that the doctors who are performing these horrendous procedures on small children are going to ever face justice. But if they stop doing it, I will take that. That's my optimistic scenario.
Okay. And then now, that sounds more like in line with the madness of crowds things. You remember the witch burning?
Yes.
Like these things come, they take the masses by wave, and somehow they recede, and then they go into the history books. And then what about the most pessimistic scenario?
So the pessimistic scenario is that this is a once in a millennium perfect storm, because this isn't just a madness of crowds, and it isn't just a psychic contagion. This is a huge political shift as well. It's polarization, it's populism of two different sorts, right and left. It's America splintering in two in particular. And, where America goes, the rest of the world unfortunately follows. I mean, we're following you down this particular path of madness. So the pessimistic scenario is that the polarization continues, and each side in America can look at the other side and look at the crazy, crazy, crazy things the other side is saying. And it, doubles and trebles them down on their own side. And that means their own side can be even madder, because, if the other side are literally saying there's no such thing as male and female, well, you can do what you like. Your own supporters will stay with you, and vice versa. I'm really not a fan of the Republicans under Donald Trump at all. So this is me, not me saying, oh, Democrats bad only. And the two sides get worse and worse, and America breaks, actually breaks. Your civic institutions break. I don't know what that would look like. You actually break. Yeah. And if America breaks, I don't know what happens to the world. To the rest of the world. That's not just because of the trans issue, but it's the maddest issue. Yeah. Like race is obviously the most neuralgic issue. But nothing as stupid is said in race as is said in sex. There's nothing that makes me think, you guys have lost all touch with reality.
No, and this is the weird disconnect, is just in your day-to-day life when we interact with colleagues, with parents, with, just the general public, when you're doing your groceries, just in your day-to-day life, everything seems to be so normal. And all the institutions seem to be functioning just properly. And then you get into the institutions of culture and you think, goodness me, it's...
Yeah, the first time that I wrote about this, when I had to pitch a leader on it, and people who had never said anything to me before about anything that I'd written. And goodness, I wrote about all sorts of things. I wrote about doctor-assisted dying. I wrote about paedophilia. I wrote about the effect of porn on children. I reported in Brazil. I saw the Amazon burning. I'd done a lot of reporting of different sorts, and this was just completely different.
Yes.
And all these people kept saying these really, really, really mad things that I just like things like, there are as many people who are not male and female as have red hair.
Yeah.
I've literally never met someone who isn't male or female. And, I'm Irish. I know a lot of people with red hair. So, how can you think that? Or, when I said, we can't just let anyone go into a women's jail, people were saying, why? I'm sorry. Yeah. Do I have to explain?
Right.
Or the other one was people saying, men aren't stronger than women. That's sexist. I got an email once from a young man saying, I know many feminists who would disagree. Sadly, he's right. Many feminists do disagree, but they're the American crazy feminists. So I felt like I had gone through into the upside down, and I still feel that. I still feel that there's this normal world that I can move around. People are doing normal things. We get our trains, we do our shopping, blah, blah, blah. And then I look and I think, there are significant numbers of people in this country and in your country who seriously, seriously pretend that boys can become girls.
Yeah.
And I just boggle yet again.
When I was in the Netherlands, I remember this was in the gender studies curriculum. People didn't take that very seriously.
And what a mistake it was that we didn't take it seriously.
That's exactly it. So I did hear people voice these things, but I just, we sort of used to brush it off like, oh, it's just them.
Yes, absolutely. We just thought this is crazy madness on campus, that's fine. We used to think like they'll work it out when they leave and they go and get a real job. No, what happened was they went and they ruined their bloody institutions when they got their real job.
Yeah. But what makes America unique and different from, say, the continent? I've been to Australia, I've heard these things. These ideas have been living on the left side of the ideological spectrum for a while. But they were considered far left. They were considered nutty. They were considered remnants of whatever the Soviet Union experiments were. What makes America different is that it just becomes contagion. It went from being something laughable to legislation that's adopted by the state of California, and it's now making its way to the federal level, and that's just what's so crazy. These corporations that are falling over,
Yeah, the other thing I would say about the perfect storm that I should have added was, of course, the journalism thing. So This arrived at just the moment when journalism was being hollowed out. And also the internet. I mean, the internet is the contagion. It's the vector whereby all of this spreads. But simultaneously, journalism has lost all its money.
Yes.
And everybody, all the big newsrooms have let go all their experienced, hard-headed, old-fashioned reporters, brought in young people who are much cheaper and have no belly and no understanding of reporting of the world, and who just parrot the party line. So, I have completely given up on a lot of American media. I mean, it was the moment when I saw that, CNN, Washington Post, and the New York Times have all written in news stories things like it's not possible to define biological sex, it's not possible to define female, it is not clear that men are stronger than women, there's no link between testosterone and physical strength. And I mean, these things are flat lies at the level of young earth creationism.
Yeah, that's
and yet they are peddled by the most reputable news organizations in the world. It's extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. And one response to it, and here is just maybe a teeny tiny light for us to avoid that once in a millennial phenomenon, is the emergence then of such things as podcasts and Substack, and the very, very serious journalists who worked for these flagship institutions. They've now embarked on starting their own platforms. Obviously, they will not be able to raise the money to do actual reporting, but they can at least influence young minds. I don't know. I'm just desperate now, really.
Yeah. So I mean, we must remember you never see where the rescue comes from until it comes. Yeah. I mean, I don't see the thing that could make all the difference. I mean, I hope my book will make a difference. I hope that can be part of it. I'm not vain enough to think it'll do it on its own. But I do subscribe to this metaphor of the pebble knocking another bigger pebble, and off it goes down the mountainside. So how exactly that'll play out, I don't know. But yes, there are always places where people can speak, and we circumvent the restrictions on social media. I mean, Twitter just kicks anyone off who says, like the girl I was talking about, the detransitioner, she got kicked off Twitter, and the reason she got kicked off Twitter is she got into an argument with a trans woman who, so that's a male person, just to remind your readers, it's a male person who has been through some operations and presents themselves as a woman. And this trans woman said to this detransitioner, "I'm every bit as female as you, not as much a woman as you, female, because you've had a hysterectomy." So what she was saying was that a female person who's had their womb removed is the same as a male person. And my friend said just 2 words. She said, "delusional male."
Yes.
Which I think is a fair description.
Yes.
And she lost her Twitter account.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. So we have to circumvent them. This is back to my apocalyptic vision. We have to build everything again.
Well, you have done your bit, and I'm truly grateful. And I also
thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much for doing it. Thank you for taking the time, and also for tying, not just time and resources, but your reputation to this fight for human rights and for sanity and for the return of common sense.
I would never have been able to live with myself, if I had ignored this story. Like, why the hell did I go into journalism if I wasn't going to write the biggest story I had ever seen?
Yeah.
And so I made my peace with what would happen as a result. And in fact, it's been fine.
It's been fun, and it's going to do fun. I think it is going to be very, very educational. By the way, I think it was J.K. Rowling who also made the same point and said, I've been quiet about a number of things, but I refuse to be quiet about this. I think,
exactly.
Yeah, that sentiment. So not all celebrities are insane.
She's wonderful. She's my heroine.
Yes.
In my mind, I have dedicated a book to her.
And mine too. And my son.
Oh, you too are, by the way.
Oh, no,
you're free speech, really.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I really, really loved talking to you. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Ayaan Hirsi Ali podcast. If you're enjoying this podcast, please leave me a review or rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.